There's one in every family. So, this is one of those things I might regret diving into, but I don't know, it's been on my mind, so I'm going to give it a go anyway. I'm going to talk about toxic fandoms, specifically toxic geek fandoms, and I'm going to talk in some broad strokes on a lot of this and bring up specifics in some cases, but you know, this is something, I don't have a particular thing that tipped me over into wanting to talk about this, except that it's something that I've been dealing with to various extents for a while. I mean, basically since the channel started gaining at a faster, more subscribers at a faster rate, little over a year ago. So before I start getting into anything, there's a couple things I want to preface first. The first thing is that every fandom and every section of any fandom is capable of exhibiting toxic behaviors. It is not restricted to any one specific line of thinking. It's not specific to holding a certain opinion, because that is not what is toxic. Ultimately, what is toxic, it's not what you think. It's not the opinion that you hold. It's the way you behave based on that opinion. Or to sort of paraphrase a term that I've heard in relation to, say, movies and things of that nature, it's not what you are about. It's how you are about it. So I'm going to try very hard to not have this be a condemnation of particular trains of thought or particular opinions that I may agree or disagree with, because I just want to talk about behavior. And what I don't want this to be is a series of me just wagging a finger at anybody, because it doesn't help. But when I say toxic fandom, oftentimes, much like when you attach the word toxic to anything, it does not mean that fandom itself is toxic. But it does mean that there is a particular stripe of fandom that is. And I guess the first question is, where's the line? At what point does disagreeing or not liking something start to cross over into toxic behavior? And I am going to say where, at least for me, that line is, because this is something I have to deal with. I have to deal with it in my comments section, and I do actively moderate those. But before I get down that line, I also want to kind of deal with what I feel in many ways is the elephant in the room for this. And this is mostly because I want to specify I'm aware of this, but I'm also not going to deal with it. So what I'm talking about there is it is a known phenomenon that people who hold a specific, oftentimes political view, but do not actually have a particular care for a specific fandom, will inject themselves into that fan conversation if they see something that they believe they can project their political leanings into. So, again, I don't mean this to be finger waving, but I need to deal with my own experience. And this is the sort of elements that I have had to deal with primarily where I've seen this. In a lot of, not all, but in a fair number of channels that I have seen do takedowns of things like the current series of Doctor Who, or say the new She-Ra cartoon, basically labeling it as political correctness gone mad, SJW propaganda, etc. A fair number of the channels where I find that sort of stuff, which is the sort of stuff I actively avoid, but I did kind of dig a little before sitting down to talk about this to be sure that I felt comfortable in my impression, and I do. A fair number of these actually are devoted to that topic of basically attacking whatever they feel holds the views that they don't like, as opposed to actually being fans of a property and then not liking the direction of the property, they go, hey, that thing that I never cared about is doing SJW stuff. I'm gonna rant about that. And you can find that stuff fairly easily. It's fairly easy to call out. It actually kind of a little bit came to mind after I did my video on the WhoTube community, because I mentioned how welcoming and inclusive I feel that community is. And a couple of people pointed out, I've seen some toxic elements, but then when I looked at some of the channels that people named, they had like a smattering of Doctor Who stuff, basically that only started up since or primarily since Series 11 started, or the casting of Jodie Whittaker was announced. And then all the other stuff on their channel is similar takedowns of other pieces of entertainment that they feel hold an agenda that they want to ramble about. And that's not me saying that they don't have the right to do that. They have every right to do that. But what I'm saying is, when I talk about toxic fandom, I want to talk about the people who are already fans, as opposed to the people who have an issue with something that any given property is doing, but didn't care about that property until this happened, and then inject themselves into this. Because that is a thing that happens. And that is a thing, again, as with all of this, that's a thing that happens with all sides of this. I am freely going to admit I am more liable to point out when people who complain, this is all SJW, because that's what I personally have to deal with most of the time. But I am aware that it can come from the other side of that debate as well. But again, the people who just inject themselves into these debates but weren't actually active parts of this fandom before that, I don't want to deal with them at all. So now that that's kind of established, why is the more divisive, aggressive things, why is that dictating the conversation so much? And I think there's a number of odd things that kind of happen in terms of people's mentalities. And there's several things at play, and it can vary from case to case. So, I did my review for Netflix's new She-Ra not long ago, and I found out afterwards that there's been a surprising amount of quote-unquote controversy around this, which surprised the heck out of me, because if I were to compare it to, say, the Thundercats, the new Thundercats show that came out, that I know a lot of people weren't happy about either, or even something like Teen Titans Go, I understand, while I don't agree necessarily with the fan backlash to those sorts of new adaptations, I do kind of get it, because in those cases, Teen Titans Go possibly a little more validly than Thundercats. But I get where fans of those, particularly of the earlier incarnations of those, feel like they are losing something. Because this goofier, sillier version of something they like exists, they aren't getting the version that they want. And so they actually feel a loss. She-Ra, I don't really feel like that should be in the mix, because She-Ra, to compare it to, say, He-Man had its original run that people know best, and then it had a live action film, and it had a retooling, and then it had a complete reboot, and they've been trying to get another film going since. She-Ra has been effectively dead since that original show in the 80s. It never got a revisit, never got a revamp, never got a reboot. So effectively, She-Ra hasn't existed other than as a cultural artifact since the 80s. So I don't think, or at least it shouldn't be a case of, oh, well, we're losing the version we could have had when this reboot happened. That shouldn't be in play, because there was no other version for you to say you wanted instead. Even with Thundercats, there was the previous reboot attempt that didn't move forward or last as long as the fans would have liked, but they could go, oh, but they could have kept trying that, and instead we've got this goofy Thundercats Roar thing. And again, Teen Titans very much is a similar thing. So if it's not a case of a fandom losing something, and that's another element that you could consider to be in play with some of the outcry against some of the things Marvel did in the last few years, in terms of having new people taking up the mantle of Iron Man, Ms. Marvel, the Incredible Hulk, Thor, and a few others, Wolverine. But firstly, I think in a lot of cases, I always kind of felt those concerns were over-exaggerated, because I don't know why anyone thought those were going to be permanent changes, because Marvel's never really gone in for the legacy hero thing on a long-term basis, not like DC used to. So these sorts of shakeups with Marvel are pretty much always temporary, and they're usually designed to be. But there would have been, and there is, a certain validity to say, I now don't have the hero I want and love because you have this other character being this hero. Again, the level that people take it to can be an issue, but I at least get that. But like I said, with something like She-Ra, that's weird to me, that because that shouldn't be in the mix. So why are there things like that where that happens? And I think where it starts to really cross over from, being just a frustrated fan, which I often am. Many things that I love, I'm highly frustrated with. I'm really frustrated with Star Wars. I'm really frustrated with Harry Potter right now. On occasion, I can be frustrated with Doctor Who. I love these things, but they irritate me sometimes. But where it crosses over from frustration to something a little bit more sinister is, I think, the point at which it becomes not about you being upset that you lost something, but you start to become angry that someone who isn't you gained something. And sort of the way it's been weaponized is that if a group that for whatever reason you've decided you don't like, some kind of demographic, if you see what you feel is that demographic getting something that they get to enjoy rather than you getting something, there can be, a frustration with that, but that's where I think it starts to cross over into toxicity, where the anger it's when the anger isn't rooted in, oh, I don't get to have the thing I like, but instead becomes, why do they get a nice thing? I hate them for that. And that, honestly, I think that is the line for toxic fandom, is the point at which it crosses over from, well, first of all, hate is a strong emotion. It's a stronger word. And it's one I try to not use. And not because I'm afraid of the word hate, but it's supposed to be a potent thing. And I think people overuse it. And if they truly are feeling that level of hate with things, that, as much as some people claim to be, that concerns me on a different level. But, I don't think it's toxic to say, I hate what has happened to Star Wars under Kathleen Kennedy's watch. I do think it's toxic to say, I hate Kathleen Kennedy. When you start directing your anger away from the abstract, away from the individual pieces of art, away from the franchise, and at people, when you start targeting your anger at people, be it the creators, be it critics who don't agree with your assessment of a piece of art, be it fans who are happy with something that you're unhappy with, when you start directing your anger at individuals, real people, and true, and I mean, I can get angry. I can get angry and ranty, but I try very, very hard to direct that at the work and not the people. And even when I express my frustration at the people, I try and really have it be over this specific narrative thing that they did, and not go down the path of, you're a terrible person, I hate you. Because I don't want to hate somebody for making a piece of art I didn't like. And I think there's also a tendency to really over-demonize certain fundamental political views that we don't agree with. And that kind of all gets rolled into this as well. So, and again, I think ultimately that should be coming down to execution rather than concept. So when people who have not even seen something like She-Ra are denouncing it because they believe it feeds into a left-leaning political philosophy, and they're condemning it for that without even considering how those ideas are expressed, the qualities of the piece of art that has those concepts behind it, that's, well, at best, that's frustrating. So, like, for me, I love the movie 300. I think it's a fantastic movie. I fundamentally disagree with a lot of the philosophical underpinnings of that movie, and I certainly do not agree with the major philosophies of the hero characters. But it's still a great movie. It's visually astonishing. It's really phenomenally paced. It's well acted. It's engaging as heck. The characters are charismatic. It's a great movie that has underpinnings that I don't agree with, but again, it's not what it's about, it's how it is about it. And if I didn't like 300, I like to think at least, I would not like it because it wasn't a well-made film, not because it espoused philosophical ideas that I disagree with. We've drawn so many hard lines lately where I'm on this side, you're on that side, and anything I see over there on that side of this line, that's the worst. And there is no good that can come from anything on that side. It's kind of the approach that people tend to take. But here's where I want to end on a slightly, hopeful is not the right word, reassuring note. For all that I'm saying and all that I deal with, I do still believe very firmly, and everything that I see, every time I actually stop and think and look and analyze carefully, backs this up. These elements that I'm talking about, these fans that exhibit toxic behaviors, they are very loud. And they are very good at driving the conversation. They're also the minority. They disproportionately take up an irritatingly large amount of the conversation because of how loud they are. They become very difficult to ignore. But they are not the majority. I feel incredibly confident in saying that because every time I have actually really basically run the numbers. And it's easy to lose sight, especially in social media, because I think it's a very human thing where, you put something out there, be it a tweet, a video, what have you, 100 people say they really like it. One person says it's crap. You put more weight in that because I think a lot of us, unless you have a bulletproof ego, a lot of us assume there's more honesty in criticism than compliment. But if you actually run the numbers more often than not, and I can't say this is the experience for everybody, but this is my experience. When I look at the numbers, when I compare how many really horrible comments I have to delete off something like a Star Wars video, or when I talk about LGBTQ plus representation or things of that nature, as much as I hate having to do that, and it pains me every single time I have to delete a comment or block somebody off the channel, I also can reassure myself this is not most people. And it's easy to lose sight of that because most people don't make waves. Most people have more measured feelings. And unfortunately, it's oftentimes hard to hear the voice going, well, there's good and there's bad to be had here in the middle of a shouting match between the extremes. The middle ground gets drowned out, even though the middle ground is the majority. I do very sincerely believe that when it comes to most of these things. And I think that's the thing that we really need to try and keep sight of. The toxic fan elements. Well, first of all, the other thing I'll add, they're not new. They haven't been created by the internet, by Reddit, by 4chan, by whatever. These have simply given them a platform for them to come together as a more unified force. But I can think back to my own childhood. I think in grade school of slightly older, maybe by only 4 or 5 years, but slightly older Star Wars fans giving massive grief to younger Star Wars fans because those younger Star Wars fans liked the Ewok cartoon. I don't think this has been created by the technology we have. The technology we have simply allows these people to have a megaphone. But again, we have to remind ourselves that these people are new. We've been dealing with them forever. And just because they're shouting louder does not mean that we have to give them the attention that they want. I'm not going to go so far as to claim if we ignore them, they'll go away. No, they won't. They never will. But we can, you know what we actually can do? We can address their arguments, their toxicity even, without engaging them directly. We can agree amongst each other, yeah, that thing that happened over there when this group of people drove an actor from a film off of social media through a concentrated harassment and threat campaign, yeah, that was awful, wasn't it? We don't actually need to engage them and go, you're terrible for doing that. Because engaging them is what they want. We don't have to. We can talk about it. We can talk about what's going on and we can go, yeah, we're not going to be that. We don't actually have to engage. And I think I will wrap up on that note. So, the very loaded topic of toxic fandoms. What are your thoughts on this? I know this is a bit of a divisive topic. Be respectful. And like I said, I tried very hard to not name names, so please don't let the comment section devolve into a list of who you think the worst offenders are. I don't care. Let's talk about the element. We don't have to name names. We can still have the conversation regardless. But whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Whole bunch of stuff you can do because there's buttons and there's links, including a link to my Patreon if you feel like lending me your support in that fashion. If you don't worry about it. Other links you can check out too. If you don't want to look at those, don't have to worry about that either, because at the end of the day, folks, you are the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.